Okay, so I based this on the carbon law, and I don't know if you talked about carbon law. No, so carbon law is one of the ways of conceptualizing what we need to do to fulfill the Paris Agreement. And I should say that there's definitely problems with carbon law because it, equally to the Paris Agreement, have in it that we need to have carbon capture and storage. But it's a good rule of thumb when you're talking to someone who has not been thinking about climate change on what we need to do until 2050. So carbon law states that we should cut our emissions with 50% every decade starting from 2020. So from 2020 to 2030, cut our emissions by 50%, then cut our emissions again by 50%, and then again by 50%. And then magically, we have technology that will suck carbon from the atmosphere for the rest. So it could be easier to imagine the first step. So what would my life be in 2030 if I used only 50% of the carbon we use today? It's easier by two reasons. One is because it's only now 7 years into the future, so you could imagine who you're going to be, kind of. And the other one is that it's only 50%. So it's not this huge change that is difficult to imagine what it would be like. But it's still kind of problematic because you don't really know who you're going to be in 2030. And you don't really know what kind of technological developments will happen in between here, etc., etc. Okay, so what if we didn't step into the future, but actually step backwards? So I'm now going to show you a timeline. And I just want to mention that time, of course, can be conceptualized in very different ways in different worldviews. In the Western modern worldview, we often conceive we often understand time as linear and going from like point A to point B, and it's kind of straight, etc. My only admission to that time could be considered differently is that this timeline is not horizontal, it's actually slightly slanting. It could also be because that's the easiest way to make the graphs I'm going to show you now. So we have a timeline here, and we might be somewhere here, in the middle of this timeline. And as I mentioned before, in future studies, we often do forecasting. So forecasting is when you take trends and you project them into the future. You might make quite good calculations based on different factors to make sure that you have some kind of good arguments for why these future trends would turn out this way. But that could be, for example, how many electric vehicles will we have in 2030? Well, based on all the car sales so far on electric vehicles and based on how the industry is talking about electric vehicles, based on how much battery production we could have, etc., etc., we're going to have this many electrical vehicles in the future. That's a forecasting study. And you can do all kinds of scenarios based on that. As you can see, the cone is kind of starting from the current situation and then expanding like this. So it's showing you a range of possibilities. And often you do this, you make more than one scenario to show where we could end up. And I guess that the IPCC scenarios for different emission amounts is this kind of forecasting scenarios. The second method that's usually like these are the more major methods within future studies. The second method that's been used within futures is backcasting. So in backcasting, you argue that actually what we need to do is to formulate a desirable end state. We want to go to this future. And I mean, we have data on that, so we know where we want to go. We want to go to a future where we don't use fossil fuels. And all of, well, not all of it, but much of Michael's lecture was about defining aspects of this sustainable future, especially in the end when he was talking about how they used planetary boundaries to kind of quantify in these LCAs what kind of space we have to operate within. So we could define what a desirable future is, and then we can find pathways to this future. And this method is often used to include people in defining these scenarios, etc. So it's a kind of often, not always, but often a participatory method. You could do it within a municipality, for example, to figure out if we want this municipality to be sustainable in the future, or it could be used for other, it could be used for other areas as well. But if we want this municipality to be sustainable in the future, you invite citizens, for example, to do workshops where you define what this desirable future is and also ways of getting there. I have lots of colleagues who have done these quite early. There's been a super interesting project at KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology, on GDP. So they had a project called Bortom BNP, Beyond GDP, where they were engaging quite a lot of people in looking into what that could look like. So backcasting is normative. Normative in the sense that we actually decide a desirable future that we're aiming for. Okay, but still, if this end state is 2050, I think both of these are quite difficult to work with. Especially for me, I have a hard time imagining who I'm going to be in 2050, or if I'm going to be in 2050. So what if we would move backwards in time and instead play with the past a little bit? And actually, there are concepts on this. They're not super well researched, but the concepts exist in literature. So one is to do a recasting. It's to go backwards in time, find a bifurcation point, and then argue, what if this happened? So a what if scenario here could be, what if COP15, so the climate meetings, COP15 was 2009 in Denmark. And there was quite a lot of hype around that COP meeting. I think that was around the time when Al Gore also published his book, etc. So there was lots of demonstrations, etc. around 2009 when this COP was in Denmark. So imagine that in 2009 we have decided to start phasing out fossil fuels. What could have happened? That is basically doing a forecasting. You have another kind of trends, and what kind of present states could that bring us to? What could have been different? And then we also think that there's an equivalent of a backcasting, so a pastcasting. So imagine that we have, instead of having the world we're living in currently, we have an alternative now where we have a more sustainable society. What needed to have happened for this alternative now to have appeared? And we think that these are, I don't think that none of these methods is a silver bullet, but actually to combining them or to play around with them is a way of opening up this imaginary that we need in order to find new pathways to a more sustainable society. So if you look at these two, there's quite good symmetries between these, of course, because we made the pictures like that. But there's a symmetry between recasting and forecasting, and what we think here is that you can explore different possible outcomes, but it's also a way of evoking imagination. And this can also be coined or named contrafactual scenarios. And there's lots of contrafactual scenarios in literature, in history, etc., where you can play around with what if this or that thing happened? What if this group of people won the battle instead of this group of people? What would have happened, etc.? And when it comes to backcasting and pastcasting, we think that both of them are good for exploring multiple pathways, but in pastcasting, you can reveal biases much more. And also, since we already know what have happened, it's pretty easy to realize that we're probably not going to invent a technology that wasn't invented during this time period. So, to some degree, we lose a little bit of the techno-solutionism that you can find when you look towards the future. So now I'm going to ask you, what will your life be now if we use only 50% of the oil? So if you were only using half as much oil in your everyday life, what would your life look like? Yes? We would do much less things. We would probably take the car half as much.
So we would take more time for doing things, so we would do less.
Yeah. And all of a sudden, it was more easy for you to imagine what it would be like, right? Because you know who you are now. You know how many children you have. You know what kind of job you have. You know what kind of infrastructure is around you. You know how much salary you have. So we have actually explored this together with the Swedish Transition Network, and we've developed a workshop material that we've been using together with this movement, because they wanted a method that they could use when they meet up with, like if there's a local community, like a municipality or a region or something like that, and they want to start up like new work around transitioning. They want to bring in people who have not thought about this before, and they want to do it in a safe and fun and creative manner. And we wanted to explore these contrafactual scenarios or this past casting. So we did this together. So just to very, very shortly walk you through it, when in this particular scenario, so you can develop different kinds of scenarios, but in this particular scenario, we check in together by telling each other who we were in 2008. That's the homework that they do. And then we tell them that in 2008, there wasn't a financial crisis. It was actually an oil crisis. And that oil crisis made the whole world realize that they have to phase out fossil fuels, which made us end up in a present where we only use half the oil. And then they get to sit in small groups and together discuss what would life look like today if we only use half the oil. There's also some other steps to this, but I'm not going to go into details because that will take too long. And then we categorize these, or like, you know, as you do as a workshop facilitator, you cluster them and you find themes, and they're usually the same: living, housing, transport, food, etc. And then they get to discuss in small groups again, how did we get there? Like, what needed to have happened here in Järna, which is the village where I grew up, for us to go from fossil fuel use to only half the fossil fuel use? What kind of decisions needed to be done? And it's super interesting when we do this. So we did it, we've done it 9 times. This was during pandemic partly, so that's why there's so many digital workshops here. But these are all places except for transitioners. That's only the organization as such. And it's super interesting when you become really concrete in a place. So for example, here in Hällingebygden, that's on the western coast of Sweden, they started saying, oh, so this train line that we have, we're going to open up these train stations again. And there's going to be a grocery store on every train station because we can't transport ourselves as much as we did before. So we have to get our food here, and then we can go to the train station, etc., etc. They have a huge industry of petrochemical industry there in the coastal area. And they were like, we're going to grow mussels, and we're going to have seaweed there that we use instead for lots of different things. So they became very, very concrete in the solutions. We've also used this method in different contexts. And why does it work so well? Okay, so one thing I've already said, we already know who we are today. We can imagine ourselves. We can bring our everyday practices, our everyday lives into this conversation of what kind of future do we want. And the other thing is it's a kind of a safe, and also because we've already solved it. Like giving something to someone and saying, oh, look, we've already solved it, you just need to fix some of the details here, is pretty liberating as well. And also, it's not really you in your professional role that needs to solve this later on, since it's already been solved. So you can free up your mind also in that way. So we're creating this kind of sandbox where people can play around with the future. And I'm going to finish up soon. I'm sorry to say that I only have this material in Swedish so far, but there's a translation underway, and it will be released during the first quarter of next year. And if you like the idea, you don't have to use this material, but if you just like the idea of doing these past casting scenarios, just go ahead and do it. I give the idea to you now. Yes, and the material that we brought, we have like a full manuscript of how to talk people through this, a Mirvo board, and other things. If you, like all of that, it's Creative Commons licensed as well, because I don't think this is the time where we close the doors to what we're doing. We need to have good ideas to spread. Okay, so I have a tiny bit of time left. So I'm actually going to give you one more, talk a little bit about one more of these concrete things. So as I showed you in the beginning when I was talking about how do we make people engage with this, I think we have to become better at materializing what these numbers in these scenarios are going to be like, what they mean to us. And one of the methodologies we've been using is then headline posters. Because they quite quickly make you imagine things. Also, headlines posters are something that we meet often. We use this contrafactual or postcasting methodology for online workshops where we were looking at academic flying. So equally to everything else that we need to cut down on in terms of meeting Paris Agreement, we also have to reduce our academic flying. So we held an online workshop. There were over 100 participants internationally that came. And we used this way of working through this to imagine it. So these are headline posters for that online workshop. So maybe they tickle your mind a bit. So I can just read them aloud in case it's needed. So in this one, The Traveller, it says, electric flights, few and expensive, who are they for? Or Interrail to Africa, new tunnel built by 2025. Personal flight quotas, how do they work? This, UniTeacher magazine, distance education at record 40% of global higher education. University of Peking reaches climate targets ahead of time. Researchers protest unequal flight allowances. And this, the news, says, plastic quotas, healthcare a priority sector, safe care impossible without plastics. Government decision, public institutions to be sanctioned for not hitting climate targets, and the local co-working spaces on the rise. So these are different ways of invoking a future or a past that could have been. And then finally, coming back to the graph that I showed you in the future, the carbon law, just to remind you that this is something where we need all hands on deck. This is the carbon emissions that have been during the last 3 years. And we're not following the right curve here. So we have to have new thinking if we were going to reach the Paris Agreement. And we need to engage all of us. All disciplines, all lines of work. And that's why I'm so super interested in being here. Because I was eating lunch with David before here, and I started talking about this concept that you have in another discipline, which is social construction of denial. Because I imagine that there's probably not a true climate denier in the room. We have a couple of them at KTH, to be honest, who's fighting very hard to get the word out. This is a hoax. So I'm a bit embarrassed about that. We don't have true climate deniers in the room, I think, because I think all of you know it. But there's something called social construction of denial, which is coined by Kari Marie Norgard in her book Living in Denial from 2001, maybe. I have to put the reference in the presentation. She lived 1 year in Norway in this little village, which had skiing tourism as their main income. And they already started to feel the effects of climate change. And she wondered, why do they not act more on climate here? And it turns out that because it is a topic that makes it uncomfortable, that invokes emotions such as fear or grief or anger, people didn't talk about it. And we have different ways of avoiding talking about it. It could be using humor. It could be using, like, pointing at others and say, why should we do anything? It's those over there who emit much more than us, etc., etc. And on top of that, she saw that the worst people in this context to avoid talking about it was politicians and educators. So when I got the invitation that a full faculty is going to actually sit down and talk about these things, I got super excited. So thank you for having me here. And then I'm going to do a little plug. I'm going to do a talk tomorrow at ULB in Brussels at 10 o'clock. And if you would like to come and listen to it, I'm going to talk about how we've been integrating sustainability in our computing education. David has a link for a Teams if you want to come and listen. Yeah. Thank you a lot.
Thank you.